Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Scouted Football Podcast with me, Joe Donnohue. Lots to tuck into in the transfer market, which is exactly what we're going to be discussing today. But first, if you haven't already, do check out Scouted Football on YouTube because over there, myself and Stephen Ganavas, we're putting together some bite-sized videos just like this. In fact, on this episode's very topic, and we'll continue to do so over the next few weeks. But without further ado, it's transfer season, as I just mentioned. I'm still waiting for most of the major leagues to kick into action, so we're left discussing the off-pitch matters. Sell-on fees, break clauses, exorbitant add-ons, last-minute scouting missions. Lee Scott is back, everybody, for his regular guest slot on the Scouted Pod. How does the transfer window sit with you, Lee?
From a fan perspective, I think the transfer window is great. I think that having that concentrated interest in the ins and outs of what your club are doing, what your rivals are doing, following any other clubs that you might think are smart recruitment-wise, I think it's a great way to spend the off-season. For somebody who works on a consultancy basis within football, the transfer window can be a little bit more challenging. Workload can kind of explode at very short notice depending on what's going on at any given moment, and you could find yourself jumping from one player in one kind of market to a completely different player somewhere else. So it takes a lot of concentration, a lot of adjustment, a lot of time spent on Y-Scout, if I'm completely honest, but I don't think I would change it. It's actually, I can't complain that my day job is watching football.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's. I was going to say that the transfer market is people's favorite thing, unless you work in football, which it can then grow a little bit tedious, perhaps. But no, I know where you're coming from. So yeah, today we're going to be discussing some transfers that people might have missed. Of course, there are so many that it's impossible to keep track of them all. So what we've done is we've kind of scoured. I don't know about you, Lee, but I went on Transfermarkt and just kept refreshing that page every single day, just noting down ones which I thought, oh, that'd be quite interesting. I think that one might have flown under people's radars. So that's what I've been doing. I imagine you've very much done the same. So we've both got 3 players each to discuss the lay of the land, essentially. So where they've come from, where they've gone to, the fees involved, the contract involved, what that means for the future, where they're going to play potentially in these teams. So Lee, do you want to get us kicked off first with your first one? I think we'll go with our 2 Scandinavian picks first.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. My first pick is a Norwegian winger called Aron Dønnum, who has just moved from Vålerenga in the Norwegian top flight to Standard Liège in Belgium. This is one that I thought was really interesting. Again, just touching on the consultancy side of things for me. Again, this is a player who I've recommended a few times to different clubs. From a data perspective, he was a real standout while playing in Norway in terms of his attacking output, his crosses per 90, dribbles per 90, the amount of times that he passes the ball into area, touches the opposition area, shots, XG, XA, everything seemed to be ticking all the right boxes. That it just felt as though he was ready for a move to a higher level of football. In the end, I have to say that I was a little bit surprised that move came to Standard Liège, but if anybody's listening and they're a fan of announcement videos, I just go on Standard Liège's Twitter account and find Aron Dønnum's announcement video by the club when they christened him the King of the North in true Game of Thrones style with Dønnum walking about with a big fur coat on in the summer. I'm sure he absolutely loved that. It's a nice little touch. Dønnum is a player who I think will have a real impact in Belgium. I don't think that he's going to be in Belgium for longer than maybe 12, 18 months before we start to see interest from elsewhere, just because of the type of player that he is. I think potentially one slight knock on him is that he is now 23, so I've only just managed to sneak him into Scouted Football. His birthday, I believe, he'll be 23 for the rest of this calendar year, but next year he will turn 24 and he'll be out of the reach of Scouted Football. So if anybody is interested in looking at him, maybe have a look now. Slight surprise that he stayed in Norway for as long as he did. He has been capped at senior international level, but not until this year. So, but over the last 2 years, I think he has been a real standout. If you want to see him play, he is a direct winger who's capable of picking up the ball in the wide areas or in the half space. He likes to receive the ball on the back foot to give himself a little bit of space, and he's really good manipulating the ball past the first defender and then bursting past the second and really attacking the space in the final third that's free. I think that the standard Liège strikers, Jackson Muleka especially, will really love having him there because of his delivery and the fact that he attracts so many defensive players towards him. It'll open up space for them in the penalty area, and they'll be able to take advantage of that. So I think that this season, Standard Liège are potentially going to be in a slight down curve. I watch a lot of Belgian football, and I have them down as a top 5 or top 6 team this season. And for a club who we're used to talking about in the same breath as Club Brugge and Anderlecht when they're fighting for the top of the table a good few years ago now, that's a bit of a come down. So as a team who are going through a slight transition, it makes sense, I think, to be adding a player who's got that dynamism in the final third and can make things happen on his own. Definitely a transfer I think that some people may have missed, but one that I think is going to be interesting going forward.
It's one that pricked my interest as well because, you know, I saw that obviously the announcement video, as you said, for any Game of Thrones fans, you know, it is very, I don't know, it plays up to the stereotypes, I think it's fair to say, of Scandinavians,
Yeah, a
perhaps.
little.
But it was his debut or his league debut where he comes on, he's on that right hand side and he kind of cuts inside, and it's one of those assists where it could quite easily be categorized as a shot if nobody else got on the end of it, but he kind of bends it into the 6-yard box, the corridor of uncertainty, and you know, puts it on a plate for his teammates. And it's a little window into what he's capable of. You know, I think he's a very incisive player. You know, I think. Again, I mean, well, I have a player who's potentially similar in this regard, but in terms of, you know, inside forwards and wingers, you know, you've got pure wingers, and then you've got players who are much better in the half spaces and can actually do a lot in sort of that inner channel of the pitch. And I think Dønnum is one of those players for definite. Moving on to my pick then, my first selection, and sticking with sort of the Scandinavian theme, I've gone with Jesper Lindstrøm, who left Denmark with Brøndby for Eintracht Frankfurt in the Bundesliga. He has signed a deal until 2026 for 7 million euros, which is, I think, is a reasonable deal for a club in Denmark. You know, Brøndby, they won the title last season for the first time in 16 years. So, you know, that was a huge achievement for one of the biggest clubs in Denmark. But Lindstrøm was a major part of that. He got 10 goals, 10 assists, recorded the third most non-penalty goal contributions per 90 in the Danish Superliga, which is, you know, no small feat for a 21-year-old player. And I think the thing with him is that, something which Stuart Brown touches on, goes into incredible depth about in the Scouted Football Handbook, Volume 10, with Lindstrøm, is that he's a lovely, lovely player in between lines. You know, he can carry an attack by himself with just a single burst of acceleration. He can move you 5, 10, 15 yards up the pitch with that. And it's not just that he's a good carrier in terms of being a progressive player. He's a very good passer as well. And I think that's probably the attribute that I think exemplifies him best. You know, he's very, very lively. He's flighty, and I think he gets a lot of that from the fact that his stature is quite, you know, he's quite not diminutive. He's more wiry. You know, he's a good height for the position that he plays. And the reason that I haven't, you know, outlined his position yet is because primarily he can play. Well, he can play anywhere essentially in that sort of front line. He's played as a 10. He's played as a left-sided forward, as a right-sided forward. He's played sort of as a false 9 on occasion, but that's not sort of a position where he's been listed as playing. It's more of he's kind of floated into that position mid-game. But you know, we've compared him to Mason Mount, or rather an early version of Mason Mount, when he maybe perhaps played a little bit on the forward line a little bit more when he was at Vitesse, on Scouted Football before. And I think that's quite a shrewd comparison, because while I'm not a huge fan of directly comparing players, it's the way that he moves his body and links the play. It's all very smooth. It's all very cohesive. And there are definite similarities, I think. But speaking of sort of his stature and his physical prowess, I think to survive in one of Europe's top leagues, you do, even if you don't appear to be that way, I think you do need to be you need to be quite robust, I think. And you know, Lindstrøm, he'll give as good as he gets, but you know, he will take a kicking, and I don't think that's ultimately sustainable in a division where the physicality goes up a notch, the physical demands go up a notch. And while I say he's wiry sharp rather than being wiry explosive, which can sometimes mitigate those physical battles. But I think on the whole, as a player, for his his playmaking intelligence, we wouldn't be discussing him if he hadn't just made a move, and that is because he'd still be in Denmark. Frankfurt are getting a fantastic player in him. How he fits into the new style with Oliver Glasner there will remain to be seen. But for me personally, I think his future's in the forward line. Lee, how do you see Jesper Lindstrøm potentially being used in the Bundesliga with Eintracht?
I think you're absolutely right that his move, there's going to be a step up in terms of the aggression, the speed of the game. But what he does have that set him apart when he was in Denmark and it stands him in good stead in Germany is the speed of thought. Sometimes as a young player coming into a top five league where everything is that little bit bigger, if you like, the difference in the game can be mental as much as physical, but Lindstrom already has that ability. He, as you said, it's really a really interesting comparison between him and Mason Mount of maybe 18 months ago when you talk about the positions that Mason Mount would receive the ball, and more than that, the way that he received the ball. What I really like about Lindstrom is that whenever he does take possession, whether it's in the half space or the wide area, he tends to always either be between the lines or have created a little bit of separation from the defender. And his first touch is always safe. It's he doesn't take the same touch every time. He doesn't always open out his body, but he always keeps the ball just in that safe side of the defender, and that gives him an extra couple of seconds of thinking time before he executes his next action. I think that's something that really will come out. I think German fans are going to love him because they love a kind of Thomas Muller type who has that ability to drift between lines and receive the ball from midfielders, and that's what he'll bring to Eintracht Frankfurt. But I think it's just a sign that we've been doing these podcasts for too long now, Joe, that he was actually somebody we discussed a little while ago in a previous episode, and now he's got to move to a top five club, so a top five nation, sorry. So obviously we've been talking about players for too long.
Quite clearly, yeah. Or the other eventuality is that I can't actually remember off the top of my head who Eintracht's sporting director is, but clearly they've gone and taken a look. It's not the 10 goals and 10 assists that have sparked their interest. It's rather the Scouted Football podcast. But hey, who knows? I'll have to check how many listeners we get in Frankfurt to see if people are interested to see what their new player is all about. But who's your next player? We're going to go a little bit more south, aren't we?
Yeah, we're going to go to Italy for my next player, and I've picked Matteo Lovato, the 21-year-old central defender who has just moved from Hellas Verona to Atalanta in Serie A. Lovato's a player who's really interesting. He's not a central defender that catches the eye in terms of his ability on the ball. He's not somebody typically who breaks the lines with his passes or plays diagonals to access the space in the wide areas. He's not a centre half who typically will dribble forward with the ball and try to engage the opposition press. But what he is a really, really good defender. And I think that Atalanta they've had a bit of a history of recruiting defenders who defend extremely well, which is sometimes overlooked in modern football. When you see the names of central defenders that everybody waxes lyrical about, they all tend to be comfortable in the ball these days. They all tend to be line breakers, and I'm as guilty of that as anybody else. I love a Takahiro Tomiyasu, for example, at Bologna, who is probably the typical progressive passer from the centre half position, especially when he was at St Truden before he moved to Bologna. That's really how he made his name. But Atalanta have gone out and signed a young Italian defender who is quite unheralded, I think, outside of Italy, coming from Verona, who is just a really, really, really good defender. He's a really good size, 188 centimetres. I think that translates to about 6'2.5", 6'3", around there. Quite a thin, athletic frame, but he's got quite a lot of muscle there as well. So he's capable of going up against the likes of an Edin Dzeko, for example, and playing against strikers who like to play with the back to him. But he also shows really good recovery pace, that ability to play in a back three that Gasperini really likes at Atalanta. He'll be capable of defending in wide areas when the opposition are in transition and the wing back on that side. As we know, the Atalanta wing backs are really important to their attacking game plan and they go high early. So having a player like Lovato who has that acceleration, that agility, that ability to defend in behind, just allows them to be able to play a little bit of a higher line, if you like. They'll be able to move to a higher line and defend more freely. I think that it'll be interesting to see whether Lovato goes straight into the first team. I think a lot of that will depend on what happens with Christian Romero and whether he is going to be sold on to Tottenham, as some of us are expecting. But if so, Lovato will come in with experience in Serie A already under his belt. And he's got that ability to come in and just take things in his stride and move his game to the next level, I think.
Yeah, Lovato is one which really impressed me at the under-21 Euros most recently with Italy. And truth be told, I hadn't actually seen an awful lot of him with Hellas Verona. So him getting an Atalanta move essentially as the insurance policy for Christian Romero leaving, as we anticipate, is a huge vote of confidence. He's definitely a player which I think, as you described, can plug a gap that Romero has essentially had there. So yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing him play more with Atalanta, because obviously the way in which Gasperini uses his defenders, uses his centre backs primarily, is very, very curious, very interesting. So yeah, I'll be watching a few of Atalanta's games this season, particularly if Lovato is playing. Second on my list, we've actually come back to the Premier League, so back onto British shores, and it's a player which some people might go, well, that's not a transfer that's flown under the radar. That's not one that we've missed. But I think there wasn't a great deal of fanfare about this when it first happened, and I think it was quite low key for potentially how good a deal it could be. And that's Boubakary Soumaré signing for Leicester City from Liel, and he's joined for around £18 million, which is, I mean, to me, it looks like a very cheap deal, unless I'm horrendously wrong, because I think it was around January 2020 that I think it was Soumaré himself turned down a move to Newcastle for almost twice that. I don't know the legitimacy of that bid, considering that Newcastle are notoriously tight with the purse strings, it's fair to say. But yeah, I think it's a shrewd deal for a player who is, I mean, for anybody who watches Leicester this season when Soumaré is playing, look out for the through balls. They are going to be aplenty. He's a very, very silky operator, very mobile, and while his defensive output isn't really there, at a seriously high level, he's very, very hard to bypass. He's very hard to get around. If you come up against him one-on-one, he's very good at positioning himself in the spaces which will block an attacker's clearest route to goal, or in midfield where he's obviously going to play their most dangerous pass. So, even if that output's lacking, it's he's not a complete moot point in defensive phases. I think the best and most important thing about him is he's press resistant. You'd expect him to play in sort of a double pivot, and if he's going to be playing sort of, well, it's interesting to think, because if Yuri Tielemans then is playing a little bit further forward in James Maddison's absence, then Soumaré can perhaps come in and play alongside Wilfred Ndidi. And there might be the temptation to say, oh, well, Ndidi and Soumaré, that's a really formidable duo in the middle. But Soumaré is the yin to Ndidi's yang. Soumaré is a controller. He patrols the midfield, keeps everything ticking, is pretty good at that, at short, medium, long distances. His passing is very crisp over all those distances. And I was looking into this. I was looking into the statistics of it. And last season, Ndidi averaged 3.31 passes into the final third per 90, whereas Soumaré at Lille averaged 8.2 passes into the final third per 90. So there's a marked increase there. And I think that's a major, major difference between the players. And Soumaré is very much involved, in everything going forward. He'll be the one who is involved in the early stages of build-up. He'll be the one who initially sparks the move. The pass which gets played into the attacking players, which then leaves the player who made the pass out of camera shot as Jamie Vardy or Patson Daka or someone goes through, and it often gets forgotten about, because if they don't score, it's like, oh, okay, on to the next chance. So Soumaré is that type of player, and I think that, yeah, if obviously I don't know the way that Brendan Rodgers plans to use him. But if, say, for example, he did play alongside Wilfred Ndidi, I think that has the makings of being a really brilliant on-ball, off-ball midfield partnerships, because, where one lacks, the other excels.
Yeah, I think that the main thing to say is that Leicester are really, really smart. I think that they've gone out and plugged holes and done well with their transfer business. I think a midfield three of Ndidi, Soumaré, and Tielemans is possibly one of the top 3 or 4 in the Premier League next season. Just
So balanced.
Yeah, just like you were saying, they all do things that the other doesn't do as well. They all have different strengths and yes, different weaknesses, but they complement one another and balance one another. And sometimes with squad building and recruitment, it's not about going out and signing 3 midfielders who are the best in the world. It's signing 3 midfielders who fit well and work well together. And that's the secret. And that's the secret of how Liverpool built their midfield, their functional midfield, when they won the title 2 years ago. Each player had a different strength and they all came together to form a great unit. And I think Leicester have done the same thing. Soumaré is somebody who a lot of fans of the Premier League think that he's been signed to be a destroyer like Ndidi, and you're absolutely right to touch on the fact that he's a lot better with the ball than people give him credit for. He's got that press resistance that you talked about, and that allows him to move past people and to progress the ball 5-10 yards before he releases it as well, because he's very difficult to stop. He's got long limbs, Patrick Vieira-esque with the way that he moves sometimes through the midfield, and I think that Yuri Tielemans in particular is one of the most underrated players in Europe. So having another player in that midfield to complement him will only unlock some more of Leicester's potential this season.
I think not having a midfield which is star-studded and rather having one which is extremely functional is, that was the success of Liverpool, or rather the underrated success of Liverpool in the past, over the past few years. You look at the likes of James Milner, Jordan Henderson, Gini Wijnaldum. These types of players, Fabinho. They weren't household names. I mean, obviously they were well known. They were extremely talented footballers, but you wouldn't have said put them into a midfield three and that's going to win you the Champions League, that's going to win you the Premier League. That would have been okay. I'm curious as to what you've seen there, but obviously we now recognise that they were incredibly valuable players, and I think that this season Leicester have the makings of a very, very well-rounded squad. And even if they were to lose Maddison, I think that I'd back Rodgers to be sort of tactile enough to be able to mould a team around not having that player. Because to be honest, I think last season when he wasn't in the team, they didn't suffer an awful lot. It's not like when Ndidi was out of the team and it was very hit and miss, where you kind of lost a little bit of control. I think that Leicester definitely have the makings of a very compact but springy team this next season.
Yeah, I have definitely cheated for my last selection. Instead of choosing one player, I chose 2. But just for context, these transfers flew so under the radar that I didn't pick up on them. And you talked a little bit at the start, Joe, about the latest transfers tab on Transfer Market. And that is open on my desktop all day when my computer's on. I refresh it every so often just to see if there's anything gone through that I've missed. I was actually looking for something else in the Portuguese top flight, and I happened to go through the Tondela squad. Now, Tondela are not a traditional Portuguese heavyweight. They're not a team who typically even challenge for Europa League consideration, but they are smart and they do play some really interesting football and some good passing football. And for a Portuguese side, they're really easy in the eye. And when I clicked on their squad list, I realised that they actually now had Tiago Dantas and Eduardo Quaresma. Now, Tiago Dantas is on loan from Benfica. He's a central midfielder. Eduardo Quaresma is on loan from Sporting, and he's a central defender. These are 2 players that, if you told me 12 to 18 months ago they wouldn't be in the first team at their respective clubs, I would have thought that's because they got a move to a bigger club in a top 5 league. I wouldn't have believed that they would be in a position now where they'd be playing in a mid-table Portuguese side, looking to really cement their access or entry point, if you like, to first-team football. Tiago Dantas, first of all, is a very traditional Portuguese playmaker in the centre of the park. He's diminutive. He's got a great first touch, great scanning ability. He always knows where he is in the pitch and where everything else is in the pitch. He has that almost Barcelona ability to play in the half touch or to play one touch around the corner, and he always seems to be able to move the ball to a safe space or to find a teammate while breaking a line and just keep the momentum of the game going. He's had a bit of a strange relationship, I think, with Benfica because he actually spent some time last season on loan at Bayern Munich. Although he never played, I don't think, for the Bayern first team, he did play for their second team. He was very highly rated by the technical staff at Bayern Munich, but obviously there were a lot of changes at the club with Hansi Flick moving to take the national team job. And there was talk at one point of a permanent deal between the clubs, but that never came off. When he went back to Benfica, I fully expected him to be part of the Benfica first team squad, but Benfica seem to have gone away from trusting young players, trusting their homegrown players. They're more happy to sign players from elsewhere that they think give them a better opportunity of winning now, as opposed to securing their future by allowing these players to grow within the club. So whereas 5 or 6 years ago, Tiago Dantas would have, without a doubt, in my mind, gone on to play for Benfica before getting a move to the La Liga, a Premier League club, something like that. Instead, he's going to have to go to Tondela and just play football and just experience the Portuguese top flight. But the issue sometimes with the Portuguese top flight is that there's such a drop off in quality. For all that the top 5 or 6 clubs are fantastic and really good examples, usually, of tactical innovation and attacking football, interesting tactical styles, it falls away dramatically towards the bottom of the table, and the middle of the pack sometimes can get a little bit lost in that. I think it'll be interesting to see Tiago Dantas playing a full season of top flight football. I think he will dominate a lot of games, and we're going to start seeing the same kind of hype, I think, around Dantas that we saw around Ryan Gauld last season when he was playing for Firenze. Now, obviously, he's moved to Vancouver Whitecaps, but Ryan Gauld was getting so much traction on social media because of the highlights that were coming out of his game. I think it's going to be similar with Tiago Dantas.
I was going to say, yeah, that's Ryan Gauld to Vancouver Whitecaps. That's a transfer that people might have missed in itself, isn't it?
Maybe. But that's one that might not be less of a surprise if you knew that Vancouver Whitecaps recruitment was run by a former StatsBomb analyst who is very, very, very smart. I remember speaking about this person a few years ago to René Maric, and René said that this person probably knew more about football than anyone he's ever met. And now he's in charge of recruitment at Vancouver, and obviously things are going quite well there. As a Scotsman, I'm just hoping he gets regular football and maybe doesn't get ignored by the national team going forward. But just to touch again on Eduardo Quaresma a little bit, he is a ball-playing centre-half who I thought would be in the first team at Sporting Lisbon last season. Comfortable in a back three or a back four, quite athletic, quite a lean build, but really, really good on the ball. He's maybe the opposite to Matteo Lovato I spoke about earlier on, and that his defensive work needs a little bit more development, whereas his ability on the ball is already evident. So at times with Sporting, I think that they have so much of the ball, they're looking for the central defenders to really join in. I don't know if he's gone out on loan because they don't quite trust his ability to play in a high defensive line because his pace isn't quite there. So perhaps they're looking for him to get exposure to a team where he has to defend a little bit more to try to develop that. But I was very surprised to notice that Tondela had managed to get Quaresma on loan because he was very, very highly rated, and there were talk of La Liga clubs being significantly interested in him 12 months ago. So to see him playing now for Tondela, it's a little bit of a shock and a transfer that flew under the window for me.
Yeah, I'm curious because there's obviously I don't know very much about Tondela. I don't know very much about Portuguese football beyond the big three, essentially. So I'm interested to figure out how that's going to work. Whether Tondela are going to be, as a result of these additions, obviously they're very young players, but they're very talented. I think from what you were saying, of course, they wouldn't have gone there if they weren't going to get a reasonable amount of minutes. I mean, last season Quaresma barely played as Sporting went and won the title there for the first time since I think 2002, and then obviously you had Tiago Dantas, who was sort of betwixt and between the different sides at Bayern. Some weeks he was in the first team squad, some weeks 1 week he started in the Bundesliga, and then another week he would be on the bench for the Bayern Munich Zwei team in the third tier of German football. So he was kind of pulled from pillar to post. So to get some continuity will be good to see him, obviously, because by all accounts, as Lee says, he's a player with good technical quality, and I think it will be good to see him playing regular football in a top division. Moving on to my final pick, my third and final player for transfers under the radar, transfers you might have missed rather. This one won't be under the radar for Celtic fans, considering that he's already scored his first goal in a UEFA Champions League qualifier, but he might and probably will be a new name for many other listeners, because he's been one of Ange Postecoglou's first signings for the club. Not a well-known player playing in a well-known league prior to this, because he's 19 years old. And it's Liel Abada who has joined Celtic on a 5-year deal for £3.5 million from Maccabi Petah Tikva in Israel's top flight. I feel like I had to overly justify this last pick, considering that my other two joined top half Bundesliga and Premier League clubs, and that Soumaré was a €20 million addition. But I think this is one which might have flown under certain people's radars, though. But he's played around 3 or 4 games now, 3 competitive games, 1 friendly for Celtic. And the takeaway, the main takeaway that I've got from that is that I actually don't think I've seen him take a bad first touch yet. And that's a very obviously positive thing for a new player coming in. You don't want them to be, not at the required pace, especially when you're coming from a league which isn't as prestigious as the Scottish Premiership. Coming from Israel's top flight, it's not the same level of competition. So it's, you're going to want players to hit the ground running. But yeah, he seems very reactive. Does Abada really, really alert to chances which end up falling his way, and that's pretty much how he scored his first goal for Celtic. And looking back at his goals for Maccabi Petah Tikva, that seems to be a common theme. And at around, must only be 5'7" or 5'8" at most. There's a bit of the Javier Chicharito Hernandez's about him, I think. Maybe not in the same poacher way, because he's a right winger, or rather a right inside forward mainly. But he's very reactive, very flighty, but can also hit them from range. So don't go saying that he's Chicharito incarnate, because he's not quite. He does like driving at players. But I think the first thing that I noticed about Abada, and I'm sure we'll see more of, is that his first touch is usually really, really, really crisp, very clean, and yeah, it's an interesting signing. Lee, from your perspective, what do you expect from Abada? Did you know anything about him before he signed for Celtic, or is this a player who was completely new to you as well?
No, I knew a little bit about him already. I think that his output in terms of his data profile when he was still playing in Israel was so good that he popped up in a couple of searches, and it led to me having a little bit of a look at the player. I was still a little bit surprised when I saw that Celtic were the club that were linked with him. For any listeners that don't know, Celtic are in a little bit of a mess at the moment. They did very well in that first leg that you're talking about where Abada scored, but then when Nir Biton, his compatriot, Israeli compatriot, got sent off, it was unfortunately Abada who had to be withdrawn for a tactical switch to bring on another central defender. And when he went off, Celtic really lost their dynamism, because Abada, like you said, he was very positive. Everything that he did was direct towards goal, and I think Celtic fans were really excited when they saw that. He struggled a little bit more in the second leg. Obviously, Celtic ended up losing after extra time to Midtjylland and going out of the Champions League at that point. I think Abada was a little bit quieter in the second leg than fans maybe wanted him to be, but that'll all come as part of an adjustment. I think that Celtic are in a little bit of a trouble at the moment. They're in a downturn period. Rangers look like they could very well be the dominant force in Scottish football for the next 5 years. The way things are going at the moment, they continue to recruit intelligently, whereas previously would have been talking about Celtic and lauding their recruitment department because of the transfers that they were renowned for. I think that's fallen away a little bit. You see that they've now gone out and signed James MacArthur and Joe Hart, for example. And if you're talking about signing value players who you're going to get sell on for and that are going to bring immediate value and youthful dynamism, I don't think MacArthur and Hart are that. Abada is a really interesting player. He's somebody who I think will add a different dimension to the Celtic attack. But I think it's really, really important if they're going to keep Odsonne Edouard, which is looking increasingly likely as the transfer window goes on. If Edouard is going to stay at Parkhead, then I think he's going to have to come up with a bit of a partnership with Abada quickly and get an understanding so that the two of them can really help each other thrive.
I do see that as something which could potentially happen, though, because from what I've seen already, there does seem to. I mean, this comes purely from me observing his first touch, but he knows. He always seems to know where that next pass is going. He quite likes those little give and goes, which I've been really really impressed by. And I mean, if you looked at him and the way that he was playing, you wouldn't say that this is a 19-year-old who's the highest level he's ever played is sort of a few throwaway caps for Israel. So yeah, first impressions are very, very positive. Going forward, he's got good speed, he's got good pace. He does seem as though he's a player who plays very well on the shoulder, which is interesting considering that. Obviously, I know what you said about Rangers there, but Celtic are mainly going to be up against teams who are going to sit deep, considering that that they still are one of the more dominant teams in Scotland.
Definitely.
I mean, I have a feeling that he's obviously going to be more effective as an inside forward than as a pure winger, and that's going to lend itself to that potential partnership with Eduardo or whoever's going to play there. I do think, I mean, it's early days. He's played roughly around 180, 200 minutes in a Celtic shirt, but from first glimpses, I do see him being an upgrade on James Forrest,
Yes.
purely and simply because he appears very multifaceted. He doesn't look as though he's going to end up running down blind alleys, which I think was obviously a very frustrating thing for Celtic fans with James Forrest at times. And he's very comfortable receiving in the half space, where he can either, get shots off himself or make those sort of wall pass type interchanges to break down the low blocks. So I think, yeah, it's a positive move. It's interesting because how can a recruitment department, or rather, it's not always just the recruitment department who have their fingers in the transfer pie, so to speak. But it's interesting that obviously James McArthur, who's played fewer minutes over the past 5 years than Callum McGregor played last year, I think I saw last night, which is absolutely obscene. McCarthy, sorry, and Joe Hart coming in, and also Liel Abada, which seems like a smart move. I'm seeing a bit of a disconnect here.
Yeah, I think it's always a problem when there's not that. I mean, recruitment is such a difficult thing to get right and to get right consistently. I think if clubs get it right for 2 or 3 seasons at a time, people really start to take notice. You think about Southampton from maybe 10 years ago when all the talk was of the black box that Southampton had in their recruitment room. You think about Celtic when they went out and signed Victor Wanyama, Virgil van Dijk, these caliber players, Christopher Ayer, who's obviously moved to Brentford now. All of these players were very good examples of smart recruitment when Celtic identified undervalued markets and went out and signed players that they knew they had resale value on. Odsonne Edouard is another example of that. So too was Oliver Ncham. Ncham's actually left now in a free transfer after Celtic turned down 15 million last year from Porto for him, so a little bit of a strange one there. But for a long time, Celtic were thought to be ahead of the game in terms of recruitment, but something along the way broke. And that's something that happens. Clubs go in cycles with these things. There are very, very few clubs, perhaps a handful that I can name off the top of my head. You look at Borussia Dortmund, you look at the likes of Atalanta that we've already talked about. You look at Liverpool. There are very few teams that are as consistent as those clubs are with their recruitment because clubs tend to change their focus or get a little bit carried away and try to chase the next level in terms of their recruitment, and things can fall apart then. I think that Celtic maybe got a little bit too they were a little bit too used to getting things their own way within Scottish football because Rangers were obviously on a huge downturn after their relegation down to League Two and having to come back up to the Premier League. They were too used to being able to sign players and still get domestic wins and just think about the Champions League. And I think that affected the way that they were recruiting. I think that Liel Abada is an example of recruitment where it could be very, very good. He could be a player that they're selling for 10 to 12 million in 18 months, 24 months, when he has had the statistical output in Scottish football that you might expect him to. I would say that he's going to have to adapt his style a little bit because it looks like Celtic are going to keep going with this idea of inverted fullbacks. At the moment, it's Ralston, a Celtic product, a youth product, who's playing as the right-sided fullback, and he's not getting round the outside to offer the width. So Abada will have to offer the width a little bit before he then comes inside, and I think that he will. He has got the technical ability that you talked about with that first touch, with that vision. He has got the ability to link in with Edward because Edward is an extremely intelligent striker. I think if that comes off, you're going to see him explode and have a really good output. But the rest of the recruitment at Celtic is just a little bit more worrying, I think would be the word.
Yeah, I think I'd share that because yeah, it does. It just, as I said, it seemed to be a little bit of a disconnect. But yeah, the potential partnership I think is positive, and that is somewhere where I'd be taking stock because he Abada does seem as though he's an intelligent player. He's not all sort of speed or brawn. He does seem to have that Jesper Lindström playmaking intelligence as well. I think a little bit to an extent. So I think yeah, there's some positives to take in that, but from a purely scouting and talent ID perspective, he's definitely one which I'll be keeping an eye on because it seems as though he seems like a smart transfer for a club who may have done business which isn't necessarily smart in other areas this window. But that is there are 6 players, or rather 7, given that Lee's scandalous breaking of the rules to include Tiago Dantas and Eduardo Quaresma from Tondela. They are our 6/7 players that we planned to discuss on this podcast. Transfers you might have missed. If you like this format, if you like it in more bite-sized form, then head on over to YouTube, as I mentioned at the beginning of the pod, as there'll be more on there, and there'll be more in the weeks to come as well, while the transfer window is still open. But yeah, thank you very much for tuning in. Lee, it's been a pleasure once again. Thanks for joining me.